when a desperate 8-year-old girl pounds on the door of Jakob Brennan's isolated Wyoming cabin in 1867, begging him to save her injured mother, the hardened hermit faces a choice that will shatter 3 years of carefully guarded solitude. As bounty hunters close in with deadly intent and winter storms threaten their survival, Jakob must decide whether protecting these strangers is worth risking everything he's built to forget his painful past. But when the bullets start flying and the truth about Elizabeth Morrison's dark secrets emerges, will Jakob's reluctant mercy transform into something worth dying for? A wolf howled somewhere in the darkness beyond the ridge, its lonely cry echoing across the Wyoming territory like a warning. Jakob Brennan jolted awake in his narrow bed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill that crept through the cabin walls. The same nightmare had visited him again, flames dancing across wooden beams while screams pierced the smoky air. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. 3 years had passed since he'd fled to this remote corner of the territory, yet sleep still brought back memories he'd rather forget. Outside his single window, the first hints of dawn painted the sky a pale gray, promising another day of blessed solitude. Jakob pulled on his worn leather boots and thick wool shirt, the fabric rough against his skin. His morning routine never changed: coffee first, then check the animals, repair whatever the wind had damaged overnight. Simple tasks for a simple life, far from the complications that people brought with them. The coffee pot sat cold on his small wood stove, and Jakob struck a match to light the kindling he'd prepared the night before. The flame caught quickly, dancing in the metal firebox like a miniature version of his nightmares. He pushed the memory away and focused on the comforting ritual of making coffee. While the water heated, Jakob stepped onto his covered porch and breathed in the crisp morning air. His cabin sat on a small rise overlooking a valley where a creek meandered between stands of cottonwood trees. The nearest neighbor lived 20 miles east, and that was exactly how Jakob preferred it. No one to ask questions, no one to offer help he didn't want, no one to disappoint when things went wrong. His small barn housed 2 horses, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, and an aging gelding called Buck. 3 chickens pecked around the yard, searching for insects and seeds. A vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for winter, stretched along the south side of the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was his, and no one could take it away or burn it down while he watched helplessly. The coffee began to bubble, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Jakob poured himself a cup in his favorite tin mug, the one with a small dent near the handle, from where he'd dropped it his first week here. He considered throwing it away, but somehow the imperfection made it feel more honest, more real than the fancy china he'd once owned. From his porch, Jakob could see the old wagon trail that connected the railroad depot in Bitter Creek to the scattered homesteads further west. Few travelers used it now that the railroad had pushed through to California, but occasionally a family or lone rider would pass by. Jakob always watched them from a distance, never offering assistance or conversation. People meant trouble, and he'd had enough trouble for one lifetime. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning frost that coated the grass like tiny diamonds. Jakob finished his coffee and walked to the barn to feed his animals. Copper nickered softly as he approached, her warm breath creating small clouds in the cool air. These creatures asked for nothing more than food, water, and shelter. A simple exchange he understood completely. As he scattered grain for the chickens, Jakob noticed storm clouds building on the western horizon. The weather had been unpredictable lately, with sudden temperature drops and fierce winds that rattled his cabin walls. Winter would arrive early this year. He could feel it in his bones. He'd need to check his firewood supply and make sure his root cellar was properly stocked. The chickens clucked contentedly as they pecked at their breakfast, and Jakob allowed himself a small smile. These birds produced eggs reliably, asked no questions, and never tried to change him. Unlike people, who always seemed to want something different from what he could give, he walked to the creek to fill his water buckets, his boots crunching through the dry leaves that had fallen during the night. The water ran clear and cold, tasting of snow from the distant mountains. As he knelt by the bank, Jakob caught his reflection in the still pool formed by a beaver dam. His face had grown lean and weathered during his years of isolation, his brown hair now streaked with early gray, his beard untrimmed and wild. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd given up on civilization and chosen to live apart from the world. The face in the water belonged to someone who'd learned that caring about others only led to heartbreak and loss. Better to care for animals and land, things that couldn't betray you or die because of your failures. Back at the cabin, Jakob began his daily repairs. A loose board on the porch steps needed nailing down, and the chicken coop door had worked free from its hinges again. He worked methodically, finding peace in the rhythm of hammer strikes and the solid feel of wood beneath his hands. Physical labor kept his mind occupied, and his body strong enough to handle whatever challenges the wilderness might present. The morning passed quietly, marked only by the distant cry of hawks and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves. This was the life Jakob had chosen: predictable, solitary, safe from the pain that human connections inevitably brought. He'd built his refuge carefully, surrounding himself with miles of empty prairie and his own determination to never again care enough about anyone to suffer their loss. Around midday, as Jakob repaired a gap in his fence line, he noticed something unusual on the horizon. A dust cloud rose from the wagon trail, moving slowly in his direction. Someone was coming, and from the size of the cloud, it looked like a heavily loaded wagon rather than a single rider. Jakob straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept nearby while working outside. Visitors meant complications, and complications meant trouble. He learned to trust his instincts about such things, and right now those instincts told him to be ready for anything. The dust cloud grew larger as the afternoon wore on, and Jakob could make out the shape of a covered wagon pulled by two tired-looking horses. It moved slowly, stopping frequently, as if the travelers were having difficulty with their equipment or their animals. Part of Jakob hoped they would simply pass by without stopping, continuing on to whatever destination drew them west. But another part of him, a part he tried hard to ignore, felt a flicker of curiosity about who might be traveling alone on such a remote trail. Families usually traveled in groups for protection, and single men typically rode horseback rather than driving heavy wagons. Something about this situation seemed different, though he couldn't quite identify what. As the wagon drew closer, Jakob retreated to his cabin and watched through the window. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, and the approaching storm clouds had grown darker and more threatening. If these travelers were planning to make camp tonight, they'd chosen a poor time to be caught in the open. The wagon finally came into clear view about a quarter-mile from Jakob's property. It was old and weathered, its canvas cover patched in several places. One of the rear wheels wobbled noticeably, and the horses moved with the tired gait of animals that had been pushed beyond their normal endurance. This wasn't a pleasure trip or a casual journey. These people were running from something, or towards something, with desperate urgency. Jakob felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever he sensed someone else's trouble approaching his carefully ordered world. He'd learned to recognize that feeling and respond by closing his door, loading his rifle, and waiting for the danger to pass. People in desperate situations made poor decisions, and poor decisions led to violence, betrayal, and loss. The smart thing would be to stay inside, keep his curtains drawn, and let whoever was in that wagon figure out their own problems. He had no obligation to help strangers, and every past experience had taught him that involving himself in other people's troubles only led to pain and regret. But as the wagon struggled closer, fighting against the failing wheel and the exhausted horses, Jakob found himself unable to look away. Something about the desperate determination of those travelers reminded him of his own flight to this remote place 3 years ago, when he'd been running from memories too painful to face. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Whatever problems that wagon carried, they were about to get much worse when the storm hit. The sound that shattered Jakob's afternoon peace wasn't the gentle knock of a neighbor or the confident rap of a traveling salesman. It was the desperate hammering of someone who knew their life depended on getting inside, getting help, getting saved. Each strike against his wooden door echoed through the cabin like gunshots, urgent and impossible to ignore. Jakob had been cleaning his rifle when the pounding began, and his hands automatically checked the weapon's load before he moved toward the sound. Through his window, he could see the wagon had stopped about 50 yards from his cabin, tilted at a dangerous angle where the broken wheel had finally given out completely. One of the horses stood with its head hanging low, foam flecking its mouth from exhaustion. "Please, mister," the voice was high and thin, cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. "I know somebody lives here 'cause I can see your smoke. Please help us." Jakob pressed his eye to a gap between the door planks and felt his breath catch. The person hammering on his door was a chilled little girl, with tangled dark hair and a blue dress torn at the hem. Dirt streaked her face, and her small fists were red from pounding on the hard wood. Behind her, the broken wagon sat silent, except for the occasional creak of settling wood. "My mama can't wake up," the girl cried, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "She's hurt real bad, and I don't know what to do. Please, please help us." Jakob's hand tightened on his rifle. Every instinct screamed at him to stay silent, to wait until the child gave up and went away. Children meant families, and families meant complications he couldn't handle. But something in that desperate voice reminded him of another child's cries, from a time when he'd been too far away to help when it mattered most. The girl stepped back from the door and looked directly at the gap where Jakob was watching. Her eyes were the color of prairie sky before a storm blue gray, and filled with a mixture of hope and terror that made his chest tighten painfully. "I seen you through the window, mister," she said, her voice quieter now but no less urgent. "I know you're there. My mama taught me it ain't polite to spy on folks, but I'm real scared and I don't know what else to do." Thunder rumbled closer, and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the cabin walls. The approaching storm would make any rescue attempt more difficult and dangerous, but it would also trap the child and her mother in the open with no shelter except their damaged wagon. Jakob set his rifle aside and moved to his small mirror, catching a glimpse of his wild beard and hard eyes. He looked like exactly the kind of man a smart child would run from, rather than approach for help. Yet this little girl had found the courage to pound on his door and beg a stranger for assistance. "What's your name?" Jakob called through the door, surprised by the roughness of his own voice after hours of silence. "Clara, sir," the girl replied, pressing closer to the door. "Clara Morrison. My mama's name is Elizabeth, and she's hurt real bad. A trunk fell on her when our wheel broke, and now she won't wake up no matter how much I shake her." Morrison. Jakob didn't recognize the name, which meant they weren't from any of the nearby settlements. These were true strangers, passing through on their way to somewhere else entirely. That should have made it easier to turn them away, but somehow, it only made the situation more troubling. "Where's your pa?" Jakob asked, though something in the girl's manner had already suggested she might be traveling with only her mother. Clara's voice grew smaller. "Daddy died last month. Mama says we got to get to Oregon where her sister lives, 'cause we can't stay where we was no more." A widow and an orphan, fleeing something bad enough to risk the dangerous journey west with only each other for protection. Jakob closed his eyes and tried to summon the cold indifference that had protected him for 3 years. These weren't his people, and their troubles weren't his responsibility. But when he opened his eyes and looked through the gap again, Clara was still standing there with rain beginning to darken her torn dress. Her small shoulders shook with cold or fear or exhaustion, and her eyes held the kind of desperate trust that could either save someone or destroy them completely. "Please, mister," Clara whispered, and Jakob could barely hear her over the increasing wind. "I promise we ain't bad people. Mama always says to help folks when they need it, and right now we need it real bad." The rain began falling harder, drumming against the cabin roof with increasing intensity. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by a long roll of thunder that made Clara flinch and look toward the darkening sky with obvious fear. Jakob had seen enough prairie storms to know this one would be severe. Anyone caught in the open would be soaked within minutes and could easily die of exposure if the temperature dropped as sharply as the gathering clouds suggested. Even if he wanted to turn them away, basic human decency demanded that he at least offer temporary shelter from the weather. His hand moved to the door's wooden bar, then stopped. Once he opened that door, once he let these strangers into his carefully protected world, everything would change. There would be questions to answer, decisions to make, complications he'd spent years learning to avoid. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to stay barricaded inside and let nature take its course. But Clara's desperate voice cut through his hesitation like a knife. "Mama's bleeding, mister. There's blood on the wagon floor, and I can't make it stop. I tried to bandage it like she showed me, but my hands are too little and I can't tie the knots tight enough." Blood, internal injuries, a woman unconscious, and possibly dying while her daughter watched helplessly. Jakob had seen enough death to recognize when someone was running out of time, and from Clara's description, her mother might not survive the night without help. Lightning flashed closer now, illuminating Clara's pale face through the gap in the door. The child stood her ground despite the approaching storm, despite the thunder that made her jump, despite facing a stranger who might refuse to help. Her courage in the face of such desperate circumstances reminded Jakob of qualities he'd once possessed himself, before loss and guilt had taught him that caring led only to heartbreak. "Can you lift your mama by yourself?" Jakob asked, his voice still rough but somehow gentler than before. Clara's face brightened with the first real hope he'd seen there. "No, sir, she's too heavy for me. But if you help me carry her, I can help take care of her. I know how to make tea and change bandages and keep quiet when sick folks need to rest." The practical way she spoke about caring for her injured mother told Jakob that this child had already seen more hardship than most adults. These weren't spoiled town folks looking for easy charity. They were genuine refugees with nowhere else to turn and no one else to help them. Jakob's hand moved to the door bar again, and this time he didn't hesitate. The wooden beam slid aside with a scraping sound that seemed to echo through the cabin like a gunshot. When he pulled the door open, wind-driven rain immediately began spattering the floor, and Clara stumbled backward in surprise at finally seeing him face to face. Jakob was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands scarred from years of hard work. His untrimmed beard and wild hair gave him a fierce appearance that would have frightened most children. But Clara looked up at him with nothing but gratitude and relief, as if he were the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered. "Thank you, mister," she breathed, and Jakob saw tears mixing with the raindrops on her cheeks. "I knew you'd help us. Mama always says there's still good people in the world, and I knew you had to be one of them." The faith in her voice hit Jakob like a physical blow. This child had taken one look at his wild appearance and somehow decided he was trustworthy, despite every reason to be afraid. Her trust felt both precious and terrifying, like holding something fragile that could shatter at the slightest wrong move. "Let's get your mama inside before this storm gets worse," Jakob said, grabbing his coat from its peg by the door. "Can you show me exactly where she's hurt?" Clara nodded eagerly and led him toward the broken wagon, her small legs working hard to keep up with his longer stride. The rain was falling steadily now, turning the dusty ground to mud and making every step treacherous. Lightning flickered overhead, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. As they approached the wagon, Jakob could see why Clara had been so frightened. A large wooden trunk had shifted when the wheel broke, pinning a woman against the wagon side. Her face was pale as parchment, and a dark stain on the wagon floor showed where blood had pooled beneath her injured leg. "Mama, wake up!" Clara called, climbing into the wagon beside the unconscious woman. "I brought help. The man from the cabin is going to fix you up." But Elizabeth Morrison didn't respond to her daughter's voice, and Jakob could see that her breathing was shallow and rapid signs of serious injury and possible shock. They needed to get her inside quickly, out of the storm and somewhere warm where he could properly assess her condition. Time was running out, and the hardest part of the rescue was just beginning. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandages faster than Jakob could replace them, and Elizabeth Morrison's skin had turned the color of old snow. Her broken leg twisted at an angle that made Clara whimper and look away, while storm winds howled around the cabin like hungry wolves circling their prey. "Is Mama gonna die?" Clara whispered from her corner by the fireplace, clutching a small wooden cross that had fallen from her mother's dress pocket. The child's eyes never left Jakob's face as he worked, searching for any sign of hope or despair in his weathered features. Jakob pressed a clean cloth against the worst of the bleeding and tried to keep his voice steady. "Not if I can help it, little one, but I need you to be brave while I fix her leg. Can you do that for me?" The cabin had never felt smaller than it did with 3 people inside. Jakob's simple furniture, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and his narrow bed suddenly seemed inadequate for the crisis unfolding within these walls. He'd moved Elizabeth to his own bed, the only surface large enough and soft enough to keep her stable while he worked. Outside, lightning split the sky with violent intensity, followed immediately by thunder that shook the entire structure. The storm had arrived with unexpected fury, turning the afternoon dark as evening and sending sheets of rain against the windows. Anyone caught in the open tonight would face serious danger, but Jakob's attention focused entirely on the unconscious woman whose life hung in the balance. Elizabeth's breathing had grown more labored since he'd carried her inside, and Jakob recognized the signs of internal bleeding that might prove beyond his limited medical knowledge. He'd learned basic doctoring during his years working cattle drive show to set bones, stitch wounds, and treat fever, but this situation demanded skills he wasn't sure he possessed. "What's that smell?" Clara asked suddenly, her nose wrinkling as she sniffed the air. The scent was metallic and sharp, mixing unpleasantly with the cabin's usual aromas of wood smoke and coffee. Jakob glanced toward his small kitchen area where he'd been boiling water and preparing supplies. A pot had boiled over while he worked on Elizabeth's injuries, filling the cabin with acrid steam. But beneath that obvious source lay something else, the smell of infection beginning to set in around the woman's wounds. "Just burned water," Jakob lied smoothly, not wanting to frighten Clara any more than necessary. "Can you help me by keeping that fire burning bright? Your mama needs to stay warm." Clara nodded eagerly, grateful for something useful to do. She carefully added wood to the fireplace, copying the method she'd watched Jakob use earlier. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls and providing much-needed light for Jakob's work. As he cleaned Elizabeth's wounds more thoroughly, Jakob discovered the true extent of her injuries. The fallen trunk had not only broken her leg, but had also caused deep cuts along her side, where sharp metal corners had torn through her dress and into her skin. These wounds would need careful stitching, and he wasn't certain his rough hands could manage the delicate work required. "Mr. Jakob?" Clara's voice was barely audible above the storm. "Can I tell you something?" Jakob continued working but nodded for her to continue. He'd noticed that talking seemed to help the child cope with her fear, and keeping her calm was important for everyone's sake. "Mama didn't want to come this way," Clara said, staring into the fire as she spoke. "She wanted to take the main road, where there's more people and towns and such. But I heard her talking to herself about how we couldn't go that way because someone might be following us." This revelation made Jacob's hands pause in their work. Travelers who avoided main roads usually had good reasons for staying hidden, and those reasons often involved danger that could follow them wherever they went. He'd assumed Elizabeth and Clara were simply poor folks heading west for better opportunities, but Clara's words suggested a more complicated story. "Did your mama say who might be following you?" Jakob asked carefully, trying to keep his tone casual despite the unease growing in his chest. Clara shook her head. "Just that Uncle Marcus might try to find us, and if he did, bad things would happen. Mama gets real scared whenever she talks about Uncle Marcus, and that's not like her. She ain't scared of much. Uncle Marcus." Jakob filed the name away while continuing his work on Elizabeth's injuries. Family disputes could be just as dangerous as conflicts with strangers, especially when they involve children and property. If this Marcus person was determined enough to chase Elizabeth and Clara across the territory, he might not give up easily when he discovered their trail. The storm intensified, and Jakob realized they were trapped together for the night whether he liked it or not. The rain had turned to sleet, coating everything outside with a dangerous layer of ice that would make travel impossible until morning. Even if Elizabeth recovered consciousness, moving her in such weather would likely kill her. "There's something else," Clara continued, her voice growing even quieter. "Mama's got money hidden in her dress. Lots of it. She thinks I don't know, but I seen her counting it when she thought I was sleeping. She always puts it back in the same place, sewn into her corset. Money. Enough money to make a child notice and remember." Jakob's unease deepened as he considered what this might mean. Widows traveling west rarely possessed significant cash unless they'd sold everything they owned, inherited an unusual sum, or taken something that didn't belong to them. Elizabeth Morrison's secretive behavior suggested the latter possibility. As if summoned by their conversation, Elizabeth began to stir on the bed. Her eyelids fluttered, and a soft moan escaped her lips as consciousness slowly returned. Clara immediately left her post by the fire and rushed to her mother's side, careful not to jostle the injured leg. "Mama? Mama? Can you hear me?" Clara's voice trembled with relief and hope. "You're safe now. The nice man from the cabin is taking care of you." Elizabeth's eyes opened gradually, unfocused at first, but slowly gaining clarity as she took in her surroundings. Her gaze moved from Clara's anxious face to Jakob's bearded one, then around the unfamiliar cabin with its rough wooden walls and simple furnishings. "Where?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Where are we?" "You're in my cabin," Jakob replied gently, setting aside his medical supplies. "Your wagon broke down, and your daughter came for help. You've been unconscious for several hours." Elizabeth tried to sit up, then gasped in pain as the movement pulled at her injured side. Jakob quickly but gently pressed her back down, noting how her face had gone pale again with the effort. "Easy now," he said. "You've got a broken leg and some deep cuts that are still healing. Moving around will just make things worse." "Clara," Elizabeth turned toward her daughter with obvious relief. "Are you hurt? Are you safe?" "I'm fine, Mama," Clara assured her, taking her mother's hand. "This is Mr. Jakob, and he's been taking real good care of both of us. He carried you out of the storm and fixed up your leg and everything." Elizabeth's eyes returned to Jakob's face, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. He could see intelligence there, along with pain and fear and something else, wariness that suggested she was accustomed to judging whether strangers could be trusted. "Thank you," she said finally. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." "No need for payment," Jakob replied, though Clara's words about hidden money echoed in his mind. "Just focus on getting better." Elizabeth glanced toward the window, where sleet continued to rattle against the glass. "How long have we been here? What time is it?" "Near evening," Jakob answered. "The storm hit hard right after we got you inside. We're not going anywhere tonight." Fear flickered across Elizabeth's features, not fear of staying with Jakob, but fear of something else entirely. Her hand moved instinctively toward her side, as if checking that something important was still in place. "Did anyone else come by?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Any other travelers on the road?" Jakob shook his head. "Just you two." "Why? Were you expecting someone?" Elizabeth and Clara exchanged a meaningful look that didn't escape Jakob's notice. Mother and daughter shared a secret, something that had driven them to risk the dangerous journey west and avoid the safer, more traveled routes. "No," Elizabeth said, but her tone lacked conviction. We've been alone for so long. I wondered if anyone else might need shelter from the storm." The lie came easily to her lips, but Jakob had heard enough lies in his lifetime to recognize another one. Elizabeth Morrison was definitely running from something or someone, and that knowledge put all of them in potential danger. Thunder crashed overhead with renewed violence, and Clara moved closer to her mother's bed. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and Jakob realized they might be trapped together for more than just one night. Whatever secrets Elizabeth carried, whatever dangers might be following her trail, they would have to face them together in this isolated cabin with nowhere to run. As if reading his thoughts, Elizabeth closed her eyes and whispered something that chilled Jakob's blood, despite the fire's warmth. "God help us if he finds us here." Dawn crept through the cabin windows like a guilty secret, revealing a world transformed by ice and the wreckage of the storm. Elizabeth Morrison sat propped against Jakob's pillows, her color much improved after a night of rest, while Clara perched on the edge of the bed braiding her mother's long brown hair into neat plaits. "The bleeding stopped completely," Jakob announced, checking the bandages on Elizabeth's side with hands that had grown surprisingly gentle over the past 12 hours. "Leg setting straight too. You heal fast for someone who took such a beating." Elizabeth managed a weak smile. "My grandmother always said we Morrison women are too stubborn to die easy." Looks like she was right. She winced slightly as Jakob adjusted the splint on her leg, but her eyes remained alert and focused. "I can't believe you knew how to do all this. Are you a doctor?" "Just a man who's seen his share of broken bones and bad cuts," Jakob replied, avoiding her curious gaze. "You learn things when you live out here alone." Through the window, the landscape sparkled with a coating of ice that made everything look beautiful and dangerous at the same time. Tree branches hung heavy with frozen rain, and the ground appeared treacherous for walking. Jakob's 2 horses stood in the barn doorway, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. "When do you think we'll be able to travel?" Elizabeth asked, though something in her voice suggested she already feared the answer. Jakob studied the icy conditions outside and shook his head. "Not today, that's certain. Maybe not tomorrow either. That ice needs time to melt, and your leg needs time to knit together. You try to walk on it too soon, you'll end up crippled for life." Clara looked up from her braiding, her blue-gray eyes bright with an idea. "Maybe that's good, Mama. Maybe we should stay here longer and help Mr. Jakob with his chores. He's been so nice to us, and his cabin could use a woman's touch." Clara Elizabeth Morrison, her mother scolded gently. It's not polite to invite ourselves to stay in someone's home. But Jakob found himself considering the child's suggestion with more interest than he cared to admit. The cabin had felt different with voices, other than his own echoing off the walls, and Clara's cheerful chatter had made the morning chores pass more quickly than usual. Still, the practical part of his mind reminded him that guests meant complications, and Elizabeth's fearful questions about other travelers suggested complications of the dangerous variety. "There's something I need to tell you," Elizabeth said suddenly, her voice taking on a serious tone that made both Jakob and Clara pay attention. "About why we're traveling this way, and why I was asking about other people on the road." Jakob poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into his chair by the fire, sensing that this conversation would require his full attention. Clara abandoned her braiding and moved to sit cross-legged on the floor between her mother and Jakob, clearly understanding that important adult talk was about to happen. "My husband Henry died 6 weeks ago," Elizabeth began, her hands fidgeting with the quilt Jakob had covered her with. "There was a fire at our farm outside of Kansas City. Henry tried to save the animals, but a beam fell, and—" She stopped, gathering herself before continuing. "The point is, he died, and suddenly his brother Marcus decided that Clara and I couldn't manage the property alone." Jakob nodded, having heard similar stories before. Widows often faced pressure from male relatives who believed women were incapable of handling business or property matters. "Marcus offered to marry me," Elizabeth continued, her voice hardening with obvious distaste. "Said it was the practical solution, that Clara needed a father figure, and that I needed a man to make decisions for me. When I refused, he got unpleasant." Clara reached over and took her mother's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "Tell him about the lawyer, Mama." Elizabeth's expression grew troubled. Marcus went to a lawyer and claimed that Henry had promised him the farm if anything happened. He had papers drawn up, legal documents that looked official. But I knew Henry would never have made such an arrangement without telling me. "Forged papers," Jakob said grimly. "I've seen that trick before. Did you have anything to prove your husband's real intentions?" "Henry's will was destroyed in the fire," Elizabeth replied. "But I had something else, the money from selling our cattle herd just before Henry died. $3,000 in cash that Marcus didn't know about." $3,000. Jakob let out a low whistle. That was more money than most folks saw in 5 years of hard work, enough to start a new life almost anywhere in the country. No wonder Elizabeth had seemed nervous about revealing her financial situation. "So you took the money and ran," Jakob concluded. "I took what was rightfully mine and my daughter's," Elizabeth corrected firmly. "But Marcus discovered we were gone before we'd gotten very far. He's been following us ever since, trying to catch up and force us to return." Clara spoke up from her position on the floor. "We seen him twice, Mr. Jakob. Once in Topeka, when we was buying supplies, and once at a river crossing, about 4 days back. He had 2 other men with him, and they looked real mean." Jakob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. 3 men pursuing a woman and child across the territory meant serious trouble, especially if they were willing to travel in winter conditions. Marcus Morrison and his companions wouldn't give up easily with so much money at stake. "How far behind do you think they are?" Jakob asked. Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably in the bed. "Hard to say. The storm might have delayed them, but it delayed us too when our wagon broke down. If they kept traveling in the bad weather." She didn't need to finish the thought. Jakob rose and went to his window, scanning the horizon for any signs of approaching riders. The ice-covered landscape showed no movement except for wind stirring the frozen tree branches. But that didn't mean they were safe. Determined men could travel in conditions that would stop most folks, especially if they had strong motivation to keep moving. "There's something else you should know," Elizabeth said quietly. "Marcus isn't just greedy. He has a bad temper, and he drinks too much. Before Henry died, there were rumors about Marcus and some trouble he'd gotten into with other people's wives. Henry never talked about it directly, but I got the impression that Marcus had hurt people before." The implications of this revelation settled over the cabin like a dark cloud. Jakob had dealt with violent men during his years on cattle drives and in rough frontier towns. He knew that such men rarely accepted defeat gracefully, especially when large sums of money and personal pride were involved. "Can you shoot?" Jakob asked Elizabeth bluntly. She nodded. Henry taught me to use a rifle for hunting and protection. I'm not the best shot, but I can hit what I aim at if it's not too far away. Good. Clara, what about you? Ever handle a firearm? Clara shook her head, looking suddenly very young and frightened. Mama says I'm too little still, but I can load powder and bullets real quick if someone shows me how. Jakob began mentally cataloging his weapons and ammunition. He had his rifle, a shotgun, and a pistol, plus enough bullets for a decent fight, if it came to that. But 3 against 3 weren't good odds, especially with a child to protect and an injured woman who could barely walk. Maybe they won't find us here, Clara said hopefully. We're pretty far off the main road, and with all this ice, our wagon tracks are probably covered up. Jakob wanted to agree with her optimistic assessment, but his frontier experience had taught him to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Men like Marcus Morrison had ways of following trails that went beyond simple tracking, and they often had connections with local law enforcement or other authorities who might provide assistance. We need to be ready for anything, Jakob said finally. Elizabeth, how long do you think it would take you to travel if we had to leave quickly? Elizabeth tested her injured leg carefully, trying to gauge her mobility. I could ride a horse if I had to, but walking any distance would be impossible right now. Then we prepare to make our stand here, Jakob decided. This cabin's built solid, with good sight lines in all directions. If trouble comes calling, we'll be ready for it. As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted across the frozen landscape that made all 3 of them freeze in place. It was faint but unmistakable, a distant whinny of horses somewhere to the east, carried on the cold morning air like a warning from fate itself. Clara gripped her mother's hand tighter. Mama? Was that? Elizabeth's face had gone pale again, but this time fear, rather than injury, had drained the color from her cheeks. It might be nothing, she whispered, though her eyes said she didn't believe her own words. Jakob was already moving toward his gun rack, checking loads and preparing for the possibility that their peaceful morning was about to become something very different indeed. 3 riders emerged from the morning mist like demons rising from hell, their horses breathing steam clouds as they picked their way carefully across the ice-covered ground toward Jakob's cabin. The man in the lead sat tall in his saddle, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but his posture radiated the kind of confidence that came from being accustomed to getting his way through force. Get away from that window, Jakob hissed at Clara, who had been peeking through a gap in the curtains. Elizabeth, can you move to the back corner behind the bed? If shooting starts, that's the safest spot. Elizabeth struggled to sit up straighter, her face tight with pain and fear. That's him, she whispered, catching a glimpse of the lead rider. That's Marcus. I'd know that black horse anywhere it used to belong to my husband. Jakob checked his rifle one final time, making sure a round was chambered and ready. Through the window, he could see the 3 men had stopped about 30 yards from the cabin, just outside easy pistol range but close enough for rifles. They were studying the building and the surrounding area with the careful attention of men who understood tactical situations. Jakob Brennan! The voice that called out was deep and commanding, carrying easily across the frozen yard. We know you've got my sister-in-law and niece in there. Send them out, and nobody needs to get hurt. Clara pressed herself against the wall near her mother, her eyes wide with terror. How does he know your name, Mr. Jakob? She whispered. Jacob's blood ran cold. He'd never seen these men before in his life, yet somehow Marcus Morrison knew exactly who he was and where to find him. That suggested either exceptional tracking skills or information from sources Jakob hadn't considered. Maybe someone in town told him, Elizabeth suggested quietly. If he asked questions at the general store or the saloon, but Jakob shook his head. He rarely went to town, and when he did, he kept to himself and avoided conversations. Most of the locals knew him only as the hermit who lived out on Cedar Ridge, not by name. This knowledge had come from somewhere else entirely. Brennan, Marcus called again, his voice carrying a note of impatience. I know you're listening. I've got no quarrel with you, but that woman stole $3,000 from me, and I want it back. Send her out with the money, and we'll ride away peaceful. He's lying, Elizabeth said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. That money came from our cattle sale. Henry and I worked 5 years building that herd. Jakob positioned himself at the window, where he could see all 3 riders while remaining mostly hidden behind the thick log wall. The men looked professional, not random drifters but experienced fighters who knew their business. Their horses were well fed and their equipment was quality gear, suggesting they had resources and backing beyond what a simple brother-in-law dispute would normally warrant. "You've got 1 minute to think it over," Marcus shouted. "After that, things get unpleasant for everybody." Clara tugged at Jacob's sleeve. "What are we going to do? There's 3 of them, and only one of you who can shoot good." Jakob glanced at Elizabeth, who was trying to reach the spare pistol he'd placed on the nightstand beside the bed. Her movements were awkward and painful, but determination showed in every line of her face. "I can fight," she said through gritted teeth. "I won't let that man take my daughter or my money without a battle." "Time's up, Brennan." Marcus's voice had turned ugly and threatening. "You made your choice. Boys, burn them out." One of the other riders pulled something from his saddlebag, a bottle, with a rag stuffed in the neck. The distinctive smell of kerosene drifted across the yard as he prepared to light the makeshift bomb. "Fire," Jakob muttered, memories of another burning building flooding back unbidden. "They're going to use fire." Without thinking, he raised his rifle and fired through the window. The shot boomed across the frozen landscape, and the man with the kerosene bottle toppled from his saddle with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. "So that's how it's going to be," Marcus roared, drawing his own weapon. "Take cover and keep them pinned down. We'll wait them out." The other 2 riders scattered, one moving to the left side of the cabin, while Marcus took position behind Jakob's small barn. From their new positions, they could keep the cabin under observation while remaining relatively safe from return fire. "Now what?" Clara asked, crawling over to where Jakob crouched by the window. "Are they going to wait there forever?" Jakob was wondering the same thing. He had food and water inside the cabin, but these men could simply surround the building and starve them out over time. Worse, they might decide to set fire to the cabin after dark, when the flames would be harder to fight and escape would be more difficult. "There's something wrong about this whole situation," Elizabeth said, managing to reach the pistol and check its load. "Marcus is greedy and mean, but he's not usually this organized. And how did he know to come straight here instead of searching all the homesteads in the area?" Jakob had been wondering the same thing. The precision with which Marcus had found them suggested inside information or assistance from someone familiar with the local area. But who would know about Jakob's cabin and be willing to help strangers track down a fugitive woman and child? A new voice called out from behind the barn, different from Marcus's deeper tones. "Brennan, this is Deputy Marshal Tom Wesley. You're harboring a fugitive and stolen money. Surrender now, and you won't be charged as an accomplice." A deputy marshal. That explained how Marcus had obtained such specific information about Jakob's location and identity. Law enforcement had resources for tracking people that ordinary citizens couldn't access, and a badge gave them authority to demand cooperation from reluctant witnesses. "He's lying about the money being stolen," Elizabeth hissed. "That marshal's either been fooled by Marcus's lies or he's corrupt." Jakob studied the situation from multiple angles, trying to find some advantage they could exploit. 3 armed men, at least one with legal authority, surrounding a cabin with limited escape routes. The odds were heavily stacked against them, and time favored their attackers rather than the defenders. "Wesley," Jakob called back, "I want to see some identification. Any fool can claim to be a marshal." Movement near the barn caught his attention. The man claiming to be a deputy marshal had moved into partial view, and something about his appearance struck Jakob as familiar. The build, the way he sat his horse, something that tugged at memory without quite surfacing. "You know him?" Elizabeth asked, noticing Jakob's expression. "Maybe," Jakob replied slowly. "Something about him reminds me of someone, but I can't place it." The deputy marshal held up something that glinted in the morning sunlight, presumably his badge and identification papers. "Thomas Wesley, duly appointed deputy marshal for the Wyoming territory. You're in violation of federal law, Brennan." Thomas Wesley. The name hit Jakob like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd buried beneath 3 years of determined isolation. Tom Wesley had been his partner during the cattle drive that had kept him away when his family died. Tom Wesley, who had convinced him to stay an extra week for better prices while cholera swept through their hometown. Tom Wesley, who had disappeared with half their profits and left Jakob to return home alone to find his wife and daughter dead. "Jakob?" Elizabeth's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Jakob, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, he had. Tom Wesley was supposed to be dead or disappeared forever, not wearing a badge and helping Marcus Morrison track down a widow and her child. The betrayal felt fresh and sharp, as if the 3 years between had collapsed into nothing. "I know him," Jakob said grimly, "and he's no more a deputy marshal than I am. He's a thief and a liar. And if he's here, it means this isn't just about Marcus wanting his money back." Clara looked confused by the sudden change in Jakob's demeanor. "What do you mean? If he's not really a marshal, then why is he pretending to be one?" Jakob was beginning to understand the true scope of the trap they'd fallen into. This wasn't a simple family dispute, or even a case of stolen money. Tom Wesley's presence suggested something much larger and more dangerous, a conspiracy that had been planned from the beginning and had drawn Jakob in as an unwitting participant. "Because," Jakob said slowly, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind, "I think we've all been played for fools." The sound of approaching hoofbeats from multiple directions made them all freeze. More riders were coming, and from the sound of it, Tom Wesley and Marcus Morrison had brought reinforcements that were just now arriving to complete whatever plan they'd set in motion. "How many do you count?" Elizabeth whispered, struggling to see through the window without exposing herself to enemy fire. Jakob listened carefully to the rhythm of the hoofbeats, trying to estimate numbers and positions. What he heard made his heart sink into his boots. "Too many," he replied grimly. "Way too many for us to fight." 6 additional riders materialized from the tree line like a military patrol, their horses moving in formation, and their weapons drawn and ready for action. Jakob's isolated cabin, which had been his refuge from the world's troubles, now felt like a trap with enemies closing in from every direction. 12 against 3, Jakob muttered, quickly counting the forces arrayed against them. "And one of us can barely walk." Elizabeth had managed to prop herself up near the back window, Jakob's spare pistol clutched in her hands despite the obvious pain the movement caused her. "I can see 2 men positioning themselves behind the woodshed," she reported. "They're trying to get close enough to rush the back door." Clara crouched in the corner farthest from any window, her small wooden cross pressed tightly against her chest. The cheerful, talkative child of the previous day had been replaced by a frightened little girl who understood that very bad men wanted to hurt her family. "Brennan!" Tom Wesley's voice carried clearly across the frozen yard. "You're surrounded. There's no way out of this except surrender. Send out the woman and the money, and maybe we'll let you live." Jakob ignored the shouted demand, his mind racing through possible escape routes and defensive strategies. The cabin had been built for protection against weather and wild animals, not as a fortress against armed men. Its thick log walls would stop most bullets, but the windows were vulnerable points, and the single door represented both an escape route and a fatal weakness. "There," Elizabeth whispered, pointing toward movement near the creek. 2 more coming up through the cottonwoods. "They're trying to surround us completely." The tactical situation was becoming hopeless with each passing minute. Jakob had perhaps 30 rounds of ammunition total, while their attackers clearly had superior firepower and unlimited time to plan their assault. Worse, the morning sun was climbing higher, reducing the shadows that might have provided concealment for any escape attempt. "Mama," Clara's voice was barely audible. "Are those bad men gonna hurt us?" Elizabeth looked toward Jakob with desperate eyes, seeking reassurance she could pass on to her daughter. But Jakob had no comfort to offer, only the grim reality that their situation was deteriorating rapidly. "We need to think about bargaining," Elizabeth said quietly. "Maybe if I go out there with the money, they'll let you and Clara go free." Jakob shook his head firmly. "Tom Wesley doesn't leave witnesses. If you surrender, he'll kill all of us to cover his tracks. Our only chance is to make them pay such a high price that they decide we're not worth the trouble." But even as he spoke, Jakob knew the odds were against them. Tom Wesley had clearly planned this operation carefully, bringing enough men and firepower to overwhelm any resistance. The question wasn't whether they would be defeated, but how many of their attackers they could take down first. A new sound drifted across the battlefield, the distinctive crack of breaking ice, followed by a man's curse and the splash of someone falling into the partially frozen creek. One of the flanking attackers had stepped through thin ice and was now struggling in the frigid water, his rifle lost and his effectiveness eliminated. "One down," Jakob muttered grimly. 11 to go. The accident seemed to make Tom Wesley more impatient. "That's enough waiting around," he shouted to his men. "Jenkins! Mitchell, take the front door! Rodriguez! Get around to that side window! The rest of you keep them pinned down." Jakob saw men moving through his peripheral vision, dark figures darting between the outbuildings and using the terrain to close the distance to his cabin. In minutes, they would be close enough to rush the building from multiple directions simultaneously. "Elizabeth," Jakob said urgently, "can you cover the back window? Shoot at anything that moves out there." She nodded, wincing as she shifted position to get a better angle of fire. The spare pistol looked large and unwieldy in her hands, but her grip was steady and her eyes were determined. "Clara, get under that table and stay there no matter what happens," Jakob ordered. "Don't come out until one of us tells you it's safe." The little girl nodded and scrambled under the heavy wooden table, pulling her knees up to her chest and making herself as small as possible. Her eyes remained fixed on Jakob's face, trusting him to protect her despite the impossible odds. Jakob positioned himself at the front window and selected his targets carefully. Ammunition was limited, and every shot needed to count. Through the glass, he could see Tom Wesley directing his men with hand signals, orchestrating their attack with military precision. The first rush came without warning. 2 men sprinted toward the front door while another approached the side window, their boots slipping on the icy ground but their weapons ready for action. Jakob's rifle boomed, and the lead attacker spun and fell, clutching his leg and screaming in pain. Elizabeth's pistol cracked from the back window, followed by a man's yelp of surprise and anger. "Missed him," she called, "but he's keeping his head down now." The side window exploded inward as someone smashed it with a rifle butt, sending glass fragments across the cabin floor. A gun barrel poked through the opening, searching for targets, and Jakob put a bullet through the wooden frame inches from the attacker's hand. "Can't keep this up much longer," Jakob shouted over the noise of gunfire. "They're gonna get through eventually." As if to prove his point, the front door shuddered under the impact of something heavy probably. A man using a broken tree branch as a battering ram. The wooden bar Jakob had installed wouldn't hold for more than a few more blows. Clara whimpered from under the table as another window shattered, this one at the back of the cabin near where Elizabeth was positioned. Cold air rushed in through the broken openings, and Jakob realized that even if they survived the attack, they might freeze to death before help arrived. "Tom!" Jakob shouted toward the front of the cabin. "I know who you really are. You're no marshal, and these men don't know what they're really fighting for." The battering ram attack paused, and Tom Wesley's voice carried clearly through the broken window. "Jake Brennan, should have known you'd end up in a place like this, hiding from your failures. Tell your hired guns about the cattle money you stole," Jakob called back. "Tell them how you left me to find my dead family while you disappeared with our profits." Murmurs arose from the attacking men, and Jakob sensed uncertainty creeping into their ranks. Hired fighters were one thing, but men who discovered they were working for a known thief might reconsider their loyalty. "Don't listen to him," Tom Wesley shouted angrily. "He's desperate. He'll say anything to save his own skin." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Jakob pressed his advantage. "Check his credentials. Ask him to show you his real marshal's badge, instead of whatever fake one he's carrying." The front door splintered under another blow from the battering ram, and Jakob knew their time for psychological warfare was running out. In seconds, armed men would pour through that opening, and the battle would become a close-quarters massacre. Elizabeth fired her pistol again, and this time her target cried out in genuine pain. "Got one," she called triumphantly, though Jakob could hear the strain in her voice from maintaining her awkward position. The door burst open completely, hanging from one hinge as 2 men rushed inside, with guns drawn. Jakob's rifle was empty, so he grabbed his shotgun and fired both barrels into the doorway, filling the air with smoke and the screams of wounded attackers. But more men were coming, and Jakob's weapons were all empty now. He drew his pistol for what would likely be the final moments of the battle, determined to make their victory as costly as possible. Then Clara's voice cut through the chaos like a knife through silk. "Mama! Look outside! There's more people coming!" Through the shattered windows, Jakob could see a new group of riders approaching rapidly from the east, but these weren't reinforcements for Tom Wesley's attack. They wore different clothing, carried different weapons, and most importantly, they were firing at Wesley's men instead of at the cabin. Help had arrived from an unexpected source, and the tide of battle was about to change dramatically. The thunder of 20 horses charging across frozen ground shook the very foundations of Jakob's cabin as a cavalry patrol swept down from the northern ridge like an army of angels descending from heaven. Their blue uniforms gleamed in the morning sunlight, and the American flag snapping from their guidance staff left no doubt about their identity or authority. "United States Cavalry!" bellowed the officer leading the charge, his saber drawn and reflecting the sun like a beacon of hope. "Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Tom Wesley's carefully planned attack dissolved into chaos as his hired gunmen found themselves caught between the cabin's defenders and a full military patrol bearing down on them with overwhelming force. Men who had been confident attackers moments before now scrambled for their horses, abandoning their assault in favor of desperate flight. "How did they know to come here?" Elizabeth gasped, still clutching her pistol but finally allowing herself to hope they might survive the morning. Jakob watched through the shattered window as Tom Wesley tried to rally his scattered forces, shouting commands that his men ignored in their panic to escape. 3 of the attackers were already spurring their horses toward the tree line, while 2 others had thrown down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. "Captain Morrison, Wyoming Territorial Militia." The cavalry officer's voice carried clearly across the battlefield as he approached Tom Wesley with pistol drawn. "You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer and conspiracy to commit murder, Captain Morrison." Jakob felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place in his mind. This wasn't a random cavalry patrol happening to pass by at the perfect moment. This was a planned rescue operation led by someone who shared Elizabeth's surname. "That's my brother-in-law," Elizabeth whispered, tears streaming down her face as she recognized the officer. "Henry's younger brother, James. He's nothing like Marcus James is a good man, an honorable soldier." Clara peeked out from under the table, her eyes wide with amazement at the sudden reversal of their fortunes. "Are we safe now, Mama? Are the bad men going to go away?" The answer came in the form of Tom Wesley's furious shout as cavalry troopers surrounded him and his remaining men. "This is illegal. I'm a deputy marshal conducting official business. You have no authority to interfere." Captain Morrison's response was swift and decisive. "Show me your warrant, Marshal Wesley. Show me the official papers authorizing your actions here." Tom Wesley's hand moved toward his coat pocket, then stopped as he apparently realized that whatever forged documents he carried wouldn't survive close scrutiny by a real military officer. His shoulders sagged in defeat as the weight of his exposed lies settled upon him. Jakob stepped carefully through the broken glass of his front window, emerging from the cabin with his hands visible and empty. The battle was over, but years of frontier caution made him move slowly and deliberately to avoid being mistaken for a threat by the nervous soldiers. "Captain Morrison," Jakob called out, his voice hoarse from smoke and tension, "your sister-in-law and niece are inside, alive but injured. Elizabeth needs medical attention." The captain's stern military bearing softened noticeably at mention of his family. "How badly is she hurt? Do you have a doctor among your men, Sergeant?" "Corporal Williams has field medical training, sir," replied a weathered non-commissioned officer. "He can assess injuries and provide basic treatment." Within minutes, the cabin that had been a battlefield became a field hospital, as military medics tended to Elizabeth's injuries while Jakob surveyed the damage to his home. Shattered windows, splintered furniture, and bullet holes in the walls testified to how close they had come to disaster. Captain Morrison approached Jakob with the measured stride of a professional soldier, his hand extended in greeting. "James Morrison, Captain, Wyoming Territorial Militia. I understand we owe you a considerable debt of gratitude for protecting my family." Jakob shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze of a man accustomed to command. "Jakob Brennan. I just did what anyone would do when strangers needed help." "That's not what my sister-in-law told us when we caught up with her trail yesterday," Captain Morrison replied. "According to Elizabeth's message, you risked your life to save her and Clara when you could have easily turned them away." "Message?" Jakob looked confused until Clara came running out of the cabin, her face bright with excitement despite the morning's terrors. "I sent him a letter," Clara announced proudly. "When you went to check on the horses yesterday morning, I wrote down everything that happened and gave it to that nice traveling preacher who stopped for water. I asked him to find Captain Morrison and tell him we needed help." Jakob stared at the little girl in amazement. While he had been worrying about their tactical situation and limited options, an 8-year-old child had been implementing her own rescue plan with the resourcefulness of a seasoned strategist. The preacher rode straight to Fort Collins, Captain Morrison explained. He delivered Clara's message to my commanding officer, who authorized an immediate patrol to investigate reports of criminal activity in this sector. Elizabeth emerged from the cabin supported by 2 soldiers, her leg newly splinted and her color much improved. I still can't believe Clara had the presence of mind to send for help without telling us, she said, looking at her daughter with a mixture of pride and exasperation. I didn't want to get your hopes up, Mama, Clara replied seriously. And I thought maybe Mr. Jakob wouldn't like it if he knew I was asking outsiders to come here. He seems to like being alone most of the time. The simple wisdom of the child's reasoning struck Jakob with unexpected force. She had understood his nature well enough to work around it, while still ensuring their survival, showing a level of emotional intelligence that most adults never achieved. Across the yard, Tom Wesley and his surviving accomplices were being secured with military restraints while a detail of soldiers gathered weapons and evidence. The man who had terrorized Jakob's nightmares for 3 years now looked small and defeated, his grandiose schemes reduced to a criminal conspiracy that would likely earn him a lengthy prison sentence. There's something else you should know, Captain Morrison said quietly, drawing Jakob aside from the others. Tom Wesley wasn't working alone in this scheme. We've been tracking a network of fake officials who've been preying on travelers and homesteaders throughout the territory. Jakob listened with growing interest as the captain outlined a conspiracy that went far beyond simple theft. Wesley and his associates had been using forged credentials to rob wagon trains, steal property from vulnerable widows, and even claim ownership of abandoned homesteads through fraudulent legal documents. Your place was supposed to be their next target, Morrison continued. According to our intelligence, they plan to eliminate you and claim your land as abandoned property. Elizabeth and Clara just happened to give them the perfect excuse to come here armed and ready for violence. The revelation sent a chill down Jakob's spine. His careful isolation hadn't protected him from the world's dangers after Alit had simply made him a more attractive target for predators who preferred victims with no friends or family to investigate their disappearance. How many others have they killed? Jakob asked grimly. We're still investigating, but the preliminary count is at least 7 confirmed victims over the past 2 years, Morrison replied. You 3 are lucky to be alive. Elizabeth had been listening to their conversation from her position on the cabin's front steps, and now she spoke up with quiet intensity. Henry always said that evil men succeed when good people do nothing to stop them. Maybe it's time for good people like us to start standing together instead of hiding alone. Her words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, and Jakob found himself considering possibilities he had never entertained during his years of self-imposed exile. The world beyond his ridge contained dangers that isolation couldn't prevent, but it also contained people like the Morrisons, who were willing to risk themselves for strangers in need. Clara had been playing with one of the cavalry horses under the watchful eye of a young trooper, but now she ran back to the group of adults with something clutched in her small hands. Mr. Jakob, she said breathlessly, I found this in the barn. I think it belongs to you. She held out a small silver locket, tarnished with age but still bearing the engraved initials, M.B. Jakob's hands trembled as he recognized his dead wife's jewelry, which he had thought lost forever in the fire that had claimed his previous life. Where did you find this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was in that bad man's saddlebag, Clara replied innocently. The one who said he was a marshal. I thought maybe he stole it from you. Jakob looked across the yard at Tom Wesley, understanding flooding through him like cold water. His former partner hadn't just stolen money and disappeared. He had returned to their burned town and looted whatever valuables remained, including precious mementos from Jakob's destroyed home. The locket represented more than just jewelry. It was a connection to the life he had lost, and the love he thought could never be recovered. Holding it again after 3 years of believing it was gone forever felt like receiving a piece of his soul back from the grave. Some things that seem lost forever have a way of finding their way home, Elizabeth said gently, watching Jakob's face as he cradled the precious memento. As if to prove her point, sunlight broke through the morning clouds for the first time that day, warming the frozen landscape and promising that spring would eventually follow even the harshest winter. Spring arrived at Cedar Ridge with an explosion of wildflowers that painted the valley in colors Jakob had forgotten existed during his years of seeing the world through grief-darkened eyes. Elizabeth sat on the cabin's front porch, her fully healed legs stretched out in the warm sunshine, watching Clara chase butterflies through the tall grass with laughter that had become as natural as birdsong. "Hard to believe it's only been 4 months since that morning," Elizabeth said, gesturing toward the spot where Tom Wesley's men had made their final stand. New grass had grown over the battle scars, and Jakob had repaired the cabin until it looked better than it ever had during his bachelor years. Jakob emerged from the barn, carrying a bucket of fresh milk from the cow Captain Morrison had insisted on giving them as payment for their heroic actions. The military investigation had uncovered Tom Wesley's extensive criminal network, leading to arrests across 3 territories and the recovery of stolen property worth thousands of dollars. "Clara's gotten taller," Jakob observed, settling into the chair beside Elizabeth that had become his customary evening spot. "Growing like a weed since the weather warmed up." "Growing in more ways than one," Elizabeth agreed. "Did you hear her reading to the chickens this morning? She's gotten through half of that adventure book you bought her, and her writing has improved tremendously." The transformation in Clara had been remarkable to witness. The frightened child who had pounded on Jakob's door in desperation had blossomed into a confident young girl who treated the remote homestead as her kingdom, and Jakob as the grandfather she had never known. "Speaking of transformations," Elizabeth said with a meaningful look, "when was the last time you had nightmares about the fire?" Jakob considered the question carefully. The dreams that had plagued him for 3 years had gradually faded as new memories replaced the old trauma. Instead of flames and screams, he now dreamed of Clara's laughter, Elizabeth's gentle voice, and the satisfaction of meaningful work shared with people who had become his family. "Can't remember the last one," he admitted. "Turns out having something worth protecting chases away the ghosts of things you failed to save." From the meadow came Clara's excited shout, "Mr. Jakob! Miss Elizabeth! Come see what I found!" They made their way to where Clara stood beside the creek, pointing excitedly at something in the shallow water. A family of ducks had built their nest among the reeds, and several tiny ducklings were taking their first swimming lessons under their mother's watchful supervision. "Look how brave they are," Clara exclaimed. "Even the littlest one isn't scared of the water." Jakob knelt beside the stream, watching the baby ducks paddle clumsily but determinedly through the gentle current. Their mother stayed close, ready to help if any of them got into trouble, but allowing them the freedom to learn through their own efforts. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust that help will be there when you need it," Elizabeth said quietly, her words carrying layers of meaning that only Jakob fully understood. He thought about the chain of trust that had brought them all to this peaceful moment. Clara's faith in a gruff stranger, Elizabeth's courage in seeking help, his own decision to open his door to people in need, and even young Clara's resourcefulness in sending for the cavalry without being asked. "I've been thinking," Jakob said as they walked back toward the cabin, "about what Captain Morrison said during his last visit." Elizabeth's expression grew curious. "About the territorial governor's offer?" Jakob nodded. The military investigation of Tom Wesley's criminal network had brought Jakob's actions to the attention of territorial authorities, who had offered him a position as a deputy sheriff responsible for protecting isolated homesteaders from similar threats. "It would mean traveling around the territory, checking on folks who live alone like I used to," Jakob continued, "making sure they're safe, helping them connect with their neighbors, maybe preventing other families from going through what we went through." Clara had been listening with the intense concentration she brought to all adult conversations. "Would we go with you?" she asked. "Or would you have to leave us here alone?" "That's what I wanted to talk about," Jakob replied, stopping in front of the cabin that had become their shared home. "The job comes with a house in Cheyenne, big enough for a family. There's a good school where Clara could get proper education, and Elizabeth could start that seamstress shop she's been talking about." Elizabeth's eyes brightened with possibilities she had barely dared to consider. A real town, with neighbors and shops and a future for Clara beyond what we could give her out here alone. But Clara looked troubled by the prospect of leaving the only stable home she could remember. "What about the chickens? And Copper and Buck? And all the places where we had adventures?" Jakob knelt down to her level, understanding her reluctance to abandon the security they had built together. "The animals would come with us, and we'd still visit Cedar Ridge whenever we wanted." "But Clara, There's a whole world out there full of people who need the same kind of help we gave each other. Don't you think we should share what we learned? The little girl considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. Would there be other children in town? Kids I could play with and maybe teach about taking care of animals? Lots of children, Elizabeth assured her. And a library with more books than you could read in a year. And maybe even music lessons if you're interested. Clara's face lit up with excitement as she began to imagine possibilities beyond their isolated valley. Could I learn to play the piano like Mama used to? And maybe write letters to all the lonely people we helped so they wouldn't feel forgotten? Jakob felt a familiar tightness in his chest. But this time, it wasn't fear or grief, it was the overwhelming recognition of how much love had grown in his heart for these two people who had transformed his existence from mere survival into genuine life. We could do all of that and more, he promised, rising to his feet and looking out over the valley that had been his refuge and was now becoming his launching point for a larger purpose. The sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the creek's surface like scattered jewels. In the distance, a wolf howled, not the lonely cry of isolation that had once matched Jakob's internal state, but the social call of a creature reaching out to connect with its pack. When would we leave? Elizabeth asked, practical questions mixing with dreams in her voice. Not until after harvest, Jakob replied, and not until we're sure this place will be cared for while we're gone. Maybe we could find another family that needs a fresh start. Let them homestead here, and keep it ready for our visits. Clara was already running toward the cabin, her mind buzzing with plans and possibilities. I'm going to write a letter to Captain Morrison tonight and tell him we said yes. And maybe I'll write to that nice preacher too, and thank him for delivering my message that saved us all. As they followed Clara inside, Elizabeth slipped her hand into Jakob's with the natural ease of people who had faced danger together and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate losses. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly, leaving the safety of isolation for the complications of community. Jakob looked around the cabin that had sheltered his grief for 3 years and now housed his hope for the future. The wooden cross Clara had carved for Elizabeth hung beside the door, catching the last rays of evening light and casting a shadow in the shape of an outstretched hand. I learned something important from a brave little girl who wasn't afraid to knock on a stranger's door, he replied. Sometimes the greatest safety comes not from hiding from the world, but from connecting with the people in it who share your values and your courage. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, each one a distant light that had traveled unimaginable distances to shine down on their small corner of the vast Wyoming territory. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight they were together, a family forged not by blood but by choice, ready to face whatever adventures awaited them in a world that suddenly seemed full of possibilities rather than threats. In the distance, answering the first wolf's call, came the voices of its pack, a reminder that even in the wilderness, no creature was meant to face life's journey completely alone.